This is Mrs. Palmer-Quay with the first video for Unit 16. In this video we will be looking at the structure and function of the reproductive system. To just remind you, sexual reproduction happens because there are haploid gametes that contain half the number of chromosomes, which fuse together to form a diploid zygote. Sperm are the male gametes, and ovum, ova being the plural, are the female gametes. Meiosis produces 4 gametes out of every parent cell, and those 4 gametes are genetically distinct, along with being only half the number of chromosomes, so that fertilization provides a unique new combination of alleles. Of course, you know, with families, sometimes children do seem to resemble each other, that one particular allele dominates over another. But in general, you're going to get at least some unique alleles on every new organism. To look at male and female reproductive system together for an overview, you have gonads, which is the name for the organs that make the gametes, testes in male and ovaries in females. And then there are various accessory reproductive organs that aid in the maturation of the gametes and the transportation of gametes to where fertilization can occur. The male's job is to produce sperm and deliver it to the female. The female's job is to produce ova, receive the sperm, and then after fertilization, provide a place for the developing baby. Human reproduction actually is a complex system. We have hormones and the nervous system and the reproductive system all involved. So even though we're going to focus on the organs of the reproductive system, the whole process of reproduction is actually very complex. So let's start with male reproductive organs. To just give again an overview, sperm is produced in the testes. Testes are located outside the abdominal cavity because they need to be slightly cooler than body temperature. In order for the sperm to be alive and strong, they have to be at about 96 degrees, and so the positioning of the testes in mammals in a scrotum outside the body allows for these lower temperatures and keeps the sperm healthy. From the testes, then, the immature sperm enter the epididymis, where they develop further, more specifically the flagella, the little extended part of the cell that's going to wave back and forth and allow sperm to swim their way. This develops in the epididymis. And then sperm travel back through into the abdomen through tubes called the vas deferens or the ductus deferens. To the sperm are added various secretions. They come from the seminal vesicles to provide nutrients because the sperm are going to need a lot of energy to swim their way to fertilization. And then various secretions from the prostate gland, which you have seen when we're looking at the urinary system, help maintain an alkaline environment, which is best for the sperm as well. At ejaculation, the sperm is mixed with these secretions, and the whole thing together is known as semen, and it's sent down the urethra and out the end of the penis. There's about 100 million sperm in every milliliter of semen, and there's usually 2 to 4 milliliters produced during an average ejaculation. So to look at this on the body, we've got our testes here, testis being singular, which then the epididymis being the next spot. It's actually a little more posterior than this diagram lets you believe. And then if we follow the vas deferens out of there, it goes over back into the body. This opening here, the inguinal canal, is where not only the vas deferens goes, but also this is where the blood supply and the nerve supply for the testicle comes in. So this is a very important transportation system for more than just the tube that carries the sperm. Then the vas deferens loops around the back of the bladder so that it can come into the prostate gland, which is below the bladder. And then through that, we've got some bones and stuff in the way, down the urethra and out the penis. So the urethra in males serves as both a urinary and a reproductive transport system. That's not the same for females. Seminal vesicles here in the back, this is what's producing the nutrients that are added to the sperm to become part of the semen. And let's see, we see the bladder, which you recognize from the urinary system. Here's the pubic bone, the front of the pelvis here, so we've got a mid-sagittal section that we're looking at in this picture. The very, very end of the penis is called the glans penis. That's where the most sensitive sensory density is, so that it adds to, in humans, it adds to the pleasure of sexual intercourse. Spermatogenesis is making sperm, and they are made in seminiferous tubules. That's kind of a fun word to say. There are several seminiferous tubules inside each testis, and then in those tubes, meiosis is what is producing the sperm. There are germ cells that will divide, and one of those cells will become known as a spermatocyte. The other one continues to stay as an undifferentiated cell that can divide again and make another spermatocyte. Men make sperm from puberty until they are done living, so that these germ cells for making sperm are always functional. The spermatocytes then produce spermatotids by meiosis, so one spermatocyte would produce 4 spermatotid. And then surrounding the tubules, in the spaces in between the seminiferous tubules, there are interstitial cells which produce various hormones, but especially testosterone, which is a very important hormone for men. The process is regulated by 2 anterior pituitary hormones that we mentioned earlier. FSH, which was discovered and named for women as follicle-stimulating hormone, but it actually also initiates sperm production in men, even though there are no follicles to be found in men. And luteinizing hormone, again, is named after the female process, but it's promoting the production of testosterone by these interstitial cells. So this gives you some diagrams. Here you see these seminiferous tubules organized into various lobes inside the testis. And if you look at the kind of a close-up of the inside of those tubules, a cross-section, the development happens from the outside down to the lumen, down to the center of the tube, the opening in the middle where the sperm obviously will then have to travel through there to the next stop. So we've got the various beginning germinal cell, the one that when it divides, one of those cells then becomes a spermatocyte and the other one will remain as a germinal cell, and then divides again through meiosis, 2 stages to produce 4 spermatids. Now here we've got 4 beautiful looking sperm. Everything seems to be fine when they were produced. In reality, since so many sperm are made by the average male reproductive system, often you have 2 heads or 2 tails. It's not unusual that out of those however many sperm you have being produced, there are a number that just will not pass muster. You can also see in this diagram how your seminiferous tubules then become the tubules of the epididymis that then become the tube that is the vas deferens. So this is an all-connected system. So the epididymis is the first part of the male duct system, the reproductive duct system, and it provides a storage site for immature sperm. And in this place, sperm then develop a working flagella and kind of do the final refinement down to this very streamlined, mature sperm cell. You can see that there's not much there. We have a head that contains the DNA material. There's an acrosome which contains some digestive enzymes to help this sperm break its way through into the egg for fertilization. Then you have this very dense in mitochondria connecting piece that's busy making ATP that's going to power the tail, the flagella. Sperm are the only human cells that have a flagella. We see them in other parts of the animal kingdom, in bacteria especially, but in humans it's only found in sperm. It takes about 70 days for a sperm to mature, so even though a man is making sperm constantly, there's sort of an assembly line process. Only the ones that are ready will be sent on. Sexual stimulation causes the walls of the epididymis to contract and to move things along, so that we've got, the vas deferens is also something that's going to move by muscular contraction the contents down the length of the tube. So the vas deferens, or the ductus deferens, is the second stop, and it runs from the epididymis through the inguinal canal back into the pelvic cavity, like I showed you on the picture. And I mentioned that we have this spermatic cord that contains not only the vas deferens but also blood supply and nerves. This space where it has to puncture through the abdominal muscle wall is a site, it's the most common site of a hernia in men, when a little bit of the intestinal tract starts to push through and create a bulge underneath the skin, and that's because there just is an opening that has to be there for blood vessels, and that's a known weak spot. The vas deferens empties into the ejaculatory duct, which passes through the prostate gland and merges with the urethra. And as I said, this main job of the vas deferens is to propel the live sperm from the epididymis through to the urethra. So it has thick walls of smooth muscle to allow it to do that. If someone undergoes voluntary sterilization and it has a vasectomy, it is the vas deferens that is cut, and then the ends are sealed so that no sperm can travel out of the beginning part of the tubule. It will just die and then be reabsorbed, any sperm that is made. And then finally we get to the urethra. That's the ending part of the male duct system. And as I said earlier, it serves both a urinary and a reproductive function. And we've seen with the urinary system, the urethra coming out of the bladder. This picture doesn't show the fact that you have your vas deferens coming in on the backside and attaching to the urethra through the prostate gland. I mentioned the accessory glands and how semen is produced. Just to put it down here on this slide, there are 3 glands involved. There are 2 seminal vesicles, 1 for each vas deferens, and then there is the single prostate gland. There should not be an R in that, sorry, and the bulbourethral glands, which are also known as Cowper's gland. And so all of these things secrete something that gets added together to form semen. There are nutrients to keep the sperm alive and kicking, and various secretions that help clear the natural acidity of the woman's reproductive tract to get that more neutral. So there's alkaline secretions in the semen to counteract the acid environment of the woman's vagina, so that everything is better for the sperm to swim its way towards that egg to get ready to fertilize it. Much of the male reproductive system is out in public. The penis is the external male genital organ, along with the scrotum and the testes, and you've got the bulk of the reproductive organs very visible, and for men, being used for urinary functions, men tend to be a little more comfortable with reproductive organs, and people tend to know those reproductive organs more than for women. Inside the penis, there are 3 masses of erectile tissue that can fill with blood during sexual stimulation, because, of course, the whole point of ejaculation, or getting sperm from the man into the woman, is it needs to be deposited into the vagina. Ejaculation is a sympathetic nervous response, and so again, you've got peristalsis, you've got various contractions of muscles all along the reproductive ducts, along with the muscles of the pelvic floor at climax. Men's secondary sex characteristics begin to show up at puberty, and that typically runs for men and women starting between 10 and 14 years of age. So sperm production begins at this point, and as I said earlier, it continues for the rest of a man's life. Testosterone is the key hormone when it comes to maintaining the characteristics that we see as male. Things like a deeper voice due to a change in how the larynx is this larger, thicker vocal cords. The Adam's apple becomes more predominant. Hair becomes thicker and more prominent over all of the male body, but especially on the face. That's the characteristics we see especially. The skeletal muscles and bones enlarge and thicken. They kind of go together, because as muscles get larger, they need a stronger attachment on the bone, which means the various parts of the bones have to get larger. And certain differences happen in the skeleton. The shoulders tend to broaden, and there's less broadening in other parts, like in the pelvis that you see in the women. That tends to be broader. So that this is something that is driven by hormones produced in the testes when sort of the body starts kicking into the sexual reproductive part of the lifetime. Moving on now to the female reproductive system. In this system, ovaries are the place where mature gametes are produced, and they're produced on a monthly cycle, not almost continuously like sperm are produced. The ovum travel down fallopian tubes, which are also called uterine tubes or oviducts, to the uterus. The uterus has a lining that can be shed each month, but then is regenerated as part of the cyclic process. And then the shed uterine lining, which is basically a bloody tissue, is exiting the body through the vagina, and this is the menstruation or menses. So here are some diagrams showing, again, we've got a mid-sagittal section. And so the female reproductive system here is sandwiched in between the bladder and the rectum. Notice that there are no shared tubes. The vagina, the opening into the reproductive system, is completely separate from the urethra going into the bladder. And then we have the anus here going into the large intestine behind it. The vagina then leads to the uterus. At the very, very bottom of the uterus, we have the cervix, which is kept closed with a mucus plug so that there's no chance of any bacteria going up into the uterus. And then on either side of the uterus, we have these long fallopian tubes going out to the ovaries. Looking at it from a frontal section, since the female reproductive system is very much hidden, this gives you an idea where it's placed, low in the pelvic cavity below the hip bones. And again, then looking at that frontal section, you've got paired ovaries, one on each side, which then you go into your fallopian tube and into the uterus. Notice that the fallopian tubes and the ovaries are not connected. Unlike in the male system, where everything is tightly bound with no spare openings, the female system there's a gap between the ovary and the fallopian tube. And as an ovum is released from the ovary, it's got to make its way into that opening of the fallopian tube. Oogenesis is the word for producing ovum, and so all of the potential ova that a woman have are produced before birth. There is no dividing of cells, of germ cells, after birth in women. Each ovary contains several 100,000 primary follicles that contain a potential ovum, but only about 300 or 400 of those will actually produce a mature ovum during a woman's reproductive lifespan, which lasts from puberty until menopause. Each primary follicle in the ovary consists of an oocyte and follicle cells. As you might suspect, the oocyte is what matures into the ovum, and the follicle cells are the ones involved in secreting hormones, specifically estrogen, the female hormone, which is triggered by follicle-stimulating hormone. This time the name makes sense because, as I said, this hormone is named after the female process. Estrogen is the hormone that helps mature the ovum, just like testosterone is the hormone that helps mature the sperm. So here's a little pictorial diagram. So we've got all of our primary follicles here waiting to develop, and then on a monthly basis, roughly every month, several follicles usually do, but only one actually makes it through the whole process to the rupturing of the follicle, and then this ovum is put out into the interstitial space. After the egg has been released, the cells that make up the follicle then form themselves into something called a corpus luteum. The corpus luteum then is involved in secreting progesterone, another important female hormone that is involved in getting the uterus ready for possible implantation of a fertilized egg. I also would add for this slide, even though I don't have a picture, each individual egg, the process that matures an ovum is similar to spermatogenesis, where you're starting with an oocyte and it's having a two-step meiosis process that ends up with 4 individual cells, but there is only one egg cell left. The other 3 cells are called polar bodies, and basically they are discarded. Most of the cytoplasm and all of the organelles that are in these cells, that would be in all 4 cells, end up in the egg cell itself. So that egg cells are practically macroscopic. They're about the size of a period at the end of a standard 12-point font sentence. And most of that is kind of extra stuff so that when the sperm, which is really just DNA, fertilizes the egg and that the complete chromosome set comes together, there are all of the organelles to get that cell going and dividing and starting to make that new person. The accessory organs for the female system also are based on tubes. The fallopian tube, as I already mentioned, is not connected to the ovary. The end of it has these fringe-like fimbriae, and they're secreting a fluid that, along with ciliated cells in the tubes themselves, create a current that just sort of gently pull the ovum into the fallopian tube, but it can go the wrong way. Peristalsis helps propel the ovum towards the uterus, and that whole process can take 4 to 5 days. So once that egg has been released, it takes a while for it to make its way down to the uterus. Consequently, fertilization usually takes place in the fallopian tube, and then implantation would happen later on in the uterus. If the fertilized egg, which we would call a zygote, implants somewhere other than the uterus, it's an ectopic pregnancy, and that can be a life-threatening condition. If this fertilized egg, for example, only makes it partway down the fallopian tube and then starts to grow and develop, it's close enough to the rest of the reproductive system that all of the hormones necessary for developing the support system for the embryo can arise, but it's going to be inside a tube that's not made to stretch the way the uterus is. And so the fallopian tube can rupture, it can lead to severe bleeding and hemorrhaging, and again can be life-threatening. But interestingly, sometimes just everything works out so that an ectopic pregnancy that has implanted in an ovary or in a tube that then ruptures and it just sort of attaches to the outside of the uterus or somewhere in the abdominal cavities, there have been pregnancies that have gone successfully to term. Of course, these babies are not born naturally. They must be operated on, and it's not quite a cesarean section because they're not in the uterus, but they can be surgically removed, and then you can check the web. There have been some successful results from ectopic pregnancies, but most often this will not end up being a viable pregnancy. I would also add, even though I forgot to type it onto this slide, if someone has her tubes tied, again for sterilization, for permanent birth control, it is the fallopian tube that is cut and then sealed so that the egg will be produced, but it can't make its way down to the uterus, and of course it's also then a dead end for the sperm to trying to get to the egg. After the fallopian tubes, we get to the uterus, commonly known as the womb, which is a very muscular organ. It's also able to, the cells of the myometrium, that muscular layer on the outside, are able to increase in size during pregnancy because it's smaller than your fist for a woman. It's a little bit smaller than your fist, and of course it's going to stretch quite a bit in order to contain a 9-month-old or developing fetus. So anyway, the uterus is between the bladder and the rectum, as we saw in the earlier diagrams, and its job is to receive and nourish the developing embryo. Generally, you've got a zygote when the fertilization occurs, and then the next stage is called an embryo, and then it's called a fetus until birth, though typically people will talk about a baby even in those very early months. The uterus prepares for a potential pregnancy each month, and that's why women have menstrual cycles or periods, regular preparation, and then not used uterine lining that sheds as the menstrual blood. The lining comes from this endometrium area. It's got two parts. It's got a bacillar zone, which are cells that do not change, and the functional zone. This is the part of the endometrium that rebuilds itself every month and then sheds off when pregnancy does not occur. This is also the part, the functional zone. Sometimes they think just that for whatever reason there's some backflow, and since the fallopian tubes are not tightly connected to the ovaries, some cells from inside the uterus could come out into the abdominal cavity. If they are endometrial cells, they can then sort of make their own little space here in the abdominal cavity where they will build up and shed each month. But there's nowhere for that blood to go, and so that can lead to the pain and scarring that is part of endometriosis, which some women suffer from. And we're not quite sure what causes that, but the thought is there's some kind of backflow that causes tissue from inside the uterus to actually go out the ends of the fallopian tubes and lodge somewhere inside the abdominal cavity. And then finally, the vagina, or the birth canal, is the last passage part of the woman's reproductive tract. And this is a muscular tube which provides a passageway out of the body. It receives the sperm during sexual intercourse. It maintains a rather acidic pH to inhibit the growth of any pathogens that might try to make their way in from the outside. Some women are concerned about the cleanliness of the vagina, especially having to undergo a menstrual cycle every month, and they practice something called douching, which is basically inserting water, or sometimes like water and vinegar or a commercial product like I have down here on the bottom, but sort of squirting it back up into the vagina as a way of feeling like it makes it cleaner. In actuality, douching is not necessary, and it may actually promote infection by destroying the natural flora, the bacteria that are naturally present there to keep the pH a little acidic and to not, provide a place where any pathogens could happen. Also, there's some concern that it might actually flush bacteria up into the uterus. Douching's been a very common practice. I've got an old advertisement where Lysol was recommended as what you wanted to put, and I can't imagine it was very comfortable, but there's a number of products nowadays. This one, is all natural with vinegar and water, but there really is no health benefit to douching. It's not something that is necessary, and your body is able to keep itself clean without that. Female external genitalia tend to be less well known than that of men. This part of the body is smaller, it's more hidden. It's not something that people really may even recognize that there are names for different parts of the body. Collectively, this whole area is called the vulva, but more specifically, some of the places you have, the clitoris is the sensory organ. It's a tiny bit of erectile tissue that corresponds to the glands of the penis, and so this is where the most density of the sensory nerves are to help make sex more pleasurable, as God designed it to be something to be enjoyed. The labia are paired folds of skin. There are two. The majora are the outermost folds that provide the protection to kind of keep everything hidden and moist, so that the mucous membranes on the inside do not dry out. Labia minora are the second level of folds, and these have different shapes in different women, so that there's a lot of variation in what exactly this looks like. But basically, there's a outermost skin outside with your skin, not a mucous membrane, and then the next set of fold is just mucous membrane. And then, of course, in here you've got the openings for the urethra and the vagina, and various glands that'll be secreting moisturizing and lubricating secretions to, just, as I said, that's mucous membrane, so you want to keep it all moist. You may have heard about the hymen, which is a flap of tissue covering at least over part of the opening of the vagina. That is what causes potentially pain or bleeding the first time a woman has sexual intercourse. Nowadays, with tampons being used during the menstrual cycle or just the more active physical lifestyle, many women who have never had sex do not have an intact hymen, and it's not an issue. But if it is, if a person does have an intact hymen and it seems to be covering enough of the vagina that it might be an issue for sexual intercourse, it can be cut by a doctor before it needs to be used. So menses, or the menstrual cycle, is something a woman experiences throughout her childbearing years, starting at puberty, somewhere between 10 and 14 years, and going until menopause, generally between 45 and 55 years. The cycle is regulated by certain hormones. The key two hormones are estrogen and progesterone, and these change in their levels in the bloodstream throughout the monthly cycle, and this is what causes all the different parts of the menstrual cycle to happen. There are 3 phases to each cycle. The menstrual phase, when the actual bleeding is occurring, is easy to identify, so even though it's kind of at the end of the process, it often gets counted as the beginning. The follicle phase is when the follicle stimulating hormone, which is high, is causing a stimulation of high levels of estrogen, and that in turn stimulates the ovum to mature. Estrogen also stimulates the growth of the functional layer of the endometrium in the uterus. And at the very end of the follicular phase, a sharp rise in luteinizing hormone actually triggers ovulation, and that mature ovum bursts its way out of the follicle and gets ready to be coaxed into the fallopian tubes. That ovulation often can have a little bit of pain accompanied with it, as I'm sure you can understand when you've got something breaking open. There might just be some pain. And then the last phase is the luteal phase, and this is when the ruptured follicle becomes this corpus luteum, and it begins to secrete progesterone, that other very important hormone, and progesterone gets the uterus ready for possible implantation, so that if the ovum is fertilized and it's going to go on then to develop into a baby, the progesterone is ready in the uterus for that. If no implantation occurs, and implantation itself kind of sets off a whole domino effect that keeps the progesterone levels high. But if that doesn't happen, progesterone falls naturally and follicle-stimulating hormone begins to rise and we get back into the menstrual phase. A minimal amount of body fat is necessary for menses. Women who are endurance athletes and have very low levels of body fat often stop menstruating. They experience amenorrhea. And part of the reason that the doctors feel that we're seeing younger and younger girls starting menstruation is just the rise of obesity in America. And so they're getting to higher body fat levels when they're younger, and that's triggering these hormones. This chart just shows the changes in these different hormones. So we've got estrogen and progesterone, and up here we show how the follicles are ripened, and then the mature ovum is bursting out of the follicle, and then the corpus luteum being the end result. And then it eventually just then decays and is reabsorbed. So that we've got a peak of estrogen rising up to the point of ovulation. You've got luteinizing hormone triggering the ovulation, and then progesterone rises as we're getting ready for possible implantation. Secondary sex characteristics for women, again, start to show up when puberty begins between the ages of 10 and 14. Estrogen promotes the development of the accessory organs of the female reproductive system, growth of hair in the armpits and the pubic area, the development of the breasts. And the cyclic production, as I said, of mature ova, or the menstrual cycle, begins and continues until menopause. Mammary glands are also part of the reproductive system, even though they may not come into play on all women. Their specific job, of course, is to produce milk for feeding a new infant. Milk formation is stimulated by prolactin, one of those other hormones that we talked about earlier, and then the nursing of the infant, the sucking of the infant on the breast, also then stimulates oxytocin, which causes the release of milk. Numerous ducts from the glands that produce the milk all then lead down to the nipple, and so there's just sort of a collection of milk-secreting glands that are all funneling down into one place. I want to just end with saying a few words about circumcision. Male circumcision is the removal of the foreskin, which is a flap of skin surrounding the end of the penis. It typically, or normally, would be covering the glands of the penis, which is the most highly sensory area on the penis. It's the most sensitive area. There is some evidence that circumcision, removing the foreskin, may provide some protection against HIV infection and cancer by basically allowing the not trapping anything between the foreskin and the penis itself. But that evidence is debatable, and so for somebody who practices good hygiene, it may not make that much of a difference. It certainly is part of the Judeo-Christian heritage. It's in the Bible, but it's not necessarily something that has to be done for health. Female circumcision is not circumcision. It is a partial or total removal of the external genitalia, usually done on prepubescent girls. That means girls under the age of puberty, often as infants. There is no health benefit. It tends to occur in places like the Middle East and in Africa, and major health organizations recognize it as a violation of human rights. Its purpose is to eliminate the possibility that women can get any pleasure from sexual intercourse, and it tends to be done in places where women are not valued particularly or felt it's dangerous for them to experience any pleasure from sex. Rather than female circumcision, a more accurate term would be female genital mutilation. It's still very prevalent in certain cultures, in certain places around the world. So that finishes what I want to say about the structure and function of the reproductive system in this video. There'll be one more video in this unit covering prenatal development.